When you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
But when it comes to Trump associates, be nice and be gentle and come all by yourself. Former Trump advisor Roger Stone was arrested on Friday on charges of obstruction, giving false statements, and witness tampering. The FBI went to his house without warning before dawn because they were worried he would flee or destroy evidence. Stone accused authorities of using Gestapo tactics and called his treatment worse than Osama bin Laden's. In an interview with the Daily Caller, Trump wasn't pleased either, saying, quote, I'm speaking for a lot of people that were very disappointed to see that go down that way, to see it happen where it was on camera, on top of it. That was a very, very disappointing scene. The Daily Caller then asked, would you ask the FBI to review its use of force, its militarization when it handles cases like this? And Trump responded, I think it's a good question for you to ask, and it's something I'll think about. Why might he be so upset about this raid? Well, a new court filing from Mueller's prosecutors out today said they seized both voluminous and complex evidence, including hard drives that contain several terabytes of information and spanned many years. And to top it all off, a new poll finds that 62% of Americans believe the president was aware that people like Roger Stone, Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort tried to conceal information from federal investigators. Harry, Jeremy, Ron, and Karine are all still here. Harry, what's amazing about that is you could call 62% of America. You could put 10 people in an elevator. You could pull 6 of them, and they could be circumstantial witnesses in an obstruction of justice case. It's amazing.
Yeah, and by the way, the criticisms are completely bogus. This is standard procedure for anybody who's been accused of obstruction, and an arrest warrant, not just a search warrant, issued. But this complex designation, which both parties have agreed to, is super interesting. Terabytes. That's a lot of info, and usually consistent with trying to decode. There's likely to be a lot of emails and words of Stone's himself that he thought were deleted but weren't. It's likely to completely make the case that he, with his own words, that he lied to Congress, and it might make quite a lot more. Then there are also bank and financial records. That's not something you seize to prove false statements. They obviously told a magistrate they were going after bigger fish, bigger charges, and the designation shows it. Final thing it shows, it's going to be a while. A complex case takes longer to try. If Stone stays to his stance of making Mueller go to trial, we're talking about the fall anyway.
Yeah, that was going to be my question for you, Harry, that I'm constantly warned by Justice Department sources to stay away from timing stories, that sure, Robert Mueller may be in the final chapter of all of this, but that if someone commits a crime or if a new crime is revealed to the FBI looking into Russian meddling, that crime will be investigated and then prosecuted. Is that consistent with your analysis of what they seized in Stone's home?
Completely. First, it may be the last chapter, but that doesn't mean it's not a very long chapter that takes a third of the book. But second, yes, you never know. Look at what happened with Comey and the Clinton email. It was very imprudent of Whitaker to say it's almost over, when as long as you're gathering information and evidence, you may be developing new charges. And that's not even touching on folks that we know Mueller is going to deal with one way or another, such as Kushner, Trump Jr., and possibly even Ivanka.
Ron Klain, let me read you something Donald Trump said in an interview last night with the Daily Caller. And it's amazing to me as a former staffer that he gets in trouble with the Daily Caller. As you and I both know, there are friendly interviews that you do for opportunity, but here he is saying, quote, they'll have to make their decision within the Justice Department. This is about releasing the Mueller report. They will have to make the decision as to what they do. I could have taken a much different stance. I could have gotten involved in this. I could have terminated everything. I could have ended everything. I could have just said, that's enough. Many people thought that's what I should do. The many people there, usually imaginary people, I'm told from sources that many people people, including Rudy Giuliani, his old chief of staff, Chris Christie, other former prosecutors, telling him not to do that, that will put him on a path toward impeachment.
Yeah, well, many people might have included Jared Kushner, who turns out to be the George Costanza of the Trump administration. Every piece of advice he gives is exactly and horribly wrong, including his advice to fire Jim Comey and his advice that firing Flynn would just end the Russia thing. So, look, I think the problem is, one, Trump may be getting horrible advice. But I think the other thing about that quote, Nicole, is it's absolutely and completely untrue. The fact of the matter is Trump has done virtually everything he can to stop this investigation. He fired the head of the FBI conducting the investigation. He ordered the firing of the deputy head of the FBI. He has tried to eliminate all witnesses to his obstruction from the FBI, demoting career officials in the FBI. He's gone down the path of just doing virtually everything he can to suppress the investigation, obstruct the investigation. So the idea that somehow he's just kind of let the thing run on its own accord is one of the biggest lies of all the Trump lies.
Jeremy Bash, they're not just lies meant to snooker the base and his supporters and signal to his allies in the media. They mean something in the context of an investigation. They can mean either an intent to obstruct or actual obstruction. What do you think just sort of the composite of what Ron Klain just described, what Democratic members of the House Intel Committee have been describing now for many, many months? What does that look like in the context of an investigation into obstruction of justice?
Well, and I will add one thing to Ron's excellent list, which is he fired the Attorney General because the Attorney General conducted himself correctly in the sense that he recused himself based on the advice from Ethics Council. And so another way that he wanted to effectively end the investigation was by installing his own individual acting Attorney General Whitaker to basically try to do what he could to starve the Mueller investigation. It was only because of the ferocious backlash in the public and among the Hill that I think Whitaker has held back a little bit. But look, the reason why you obstruct an investigation is because you don't want the investigator to learn the truth. And that's, I think, the reason why Mike Flynn lied to the committees, to the Bureau. That's, I think, why Michael Cohen initially lied to the Congress. That's why I think Roger Stone lied to the investigative bodies on the Hill as well. And it's fundamentally why the president has not been telling the truth about his own involvement. And he didn't want the intelligence community coming forward with their assessment in January 2017. And he doesn't want them speaking truth to power on the Hill even at this hour.
Karine, I see the politics of this shifting with the Democrats taking over control of the House and people like Adam Schiff being in charge of the House Intel Committee. And I see his war on evidence, his war on truth broadening to include the intelligence community, in part to encompass everything that they might uncover now that they're in charge, now that these will be real investigations.
That's exactly right. And Adam Schiff, he is a professional, former prosecutor. He has been really a voice of reason through the past two years, really caring about the country and talking about the Russia investigation in a way that we can all understand. And so that is the mandate of the Democrats after winning in November. Absolutely, it was to make sure that they put a check on this president, and that's what they're doing in the House.
Ron Klain, is it weird at all to see the Republicans totally cede any claim to being aligned with the mission, the purpose, or the goals of the FBI? It's weird for me.
Yeah, Nicole, I was just thinking that. You know, most cops in America are good cops. We are blessed to be served by law enforcement protecting us. But it is crazy that over the past 10 years, on average, 1,000 people a year die being arrested, 600 in homicides. 70% of those people are African American or Hispanic. Donald Trump and his allies, they have not spoken out a peep about that. And now the government comes to arrest Roger Stone and serve a search warrant. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump is interested in the topic of militarization of our police forces. You know, where was he after Ferguson? Where was he after the debate that President Obama tried to launch here? So, you know, we know what this is. He's just trying to protect his own people. He's just trying to protect his own flank. This isn't about law enforcement. This is about Donald Trump.
Nicole, can I just add? They didn't complain about use of force on Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old, or Eric Gardner, or Sandra Bland, or Alton Sterling. I mean, all folks who were murdered. And they didn't say anything about that. So this is like spare me, cry me a river on Roger Stone.
Harry Litman, I've got to give you a quick last word.
Crimea River is right. Look, Stone is potentially, we knew already that he was in personal touch with Trump. You read that indictment carefully, you combine it with the fact of the breadth of the evidence as characterized today, you have to think the odds are that Mueller is putting together a substantive case linking up with the July 2017 indictment of the Russians, a substantive case of conspiracy, campaign finance reform, fraud against the United States. That would be the biggest development in the probe to date.
All right, only you, Harry Litman, can drop a bomb like Robert Mueller's getting ready to charge a conspiracy in your quick last word. We're going to have to pick that up again tomorrow. Harry Litman, thank you for spending some time with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.